So if you've been tracking with us this year, we're in a big series called Follow Me, and every few weeks we give you a follow me, follow through. And this is a simple challenge, and the purpose is to help you connect what we talk about in Sunday morning worship service and also our Bible classes, to connect that to your everyday life. So follow through. And so this is the third or fourth one we've done this year. And if you've been tracking with us, you can, each time you complete one, you can get a sticker and mark it off on your refrigerator. If you've missed the first few, that's okay. This past week, we finally accomplished, in my family, the first two challenges of the year, and so we marked those off on our refrigerator. Well, here's the next one. It's on self-denial, which we've been talking about the last few weeks. You can read these all yourself, but I will just highlight number 4. This would be good for all of us to try this. Number 4 says this: cut your complaints per day by half. So that would be an interesting experiment. Try to complain 50% less per day. So you can pick those up there at the exits before you leave. I want you to think about the last time you heard the national anthem sung at some kind of an event. At what point did the audience start to cheer towards the end of the song? Most of the time, the audience does not cheer at the very end with the last line, home of the brave. They start cheering with the preceding line, which is land of the what? Land of the free. Tim Keller pointed this out, and I thought it was an interesting observation. It could be that people are cheering at that point because they're ready for the song to be over. However, I think that people are cheering at that moment because American people value freedom. I just think that's true. We do. In fact, a man named Robert Bola did a pretty extensive nationwide survey a few years back, trying to figure out what are the virtues that people care about in this country, and freedom checked in at number 1. We care deeply about freedom. And you can see evidence of this everywhere. This weekend, it's Veterans Day weekend. And so many of us take time to celebrate and to honor our men and women in the military who serve our country. And I think deep down we know that the freedom that we experience in the United States of America isn't free, as the saying goes. It does come at a cost. And so we honor these people who give so much time and sacrifice so much of their lives for this country. We value freedom. Another place you can see this is in how much we care about our rights. And specifically, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to bear arms. We care deeply about these rights. Like you don't want someone telling you what you can say and what you can't say. And we don't want anybody telling us where and when we can worship and where and when we cannot worship. We certainly don't want anybody telling us who we can or cannot worship. And we don't want anybody telling us what we can or cannot carry. These rights are very deeply ingrained in our hearts. We care deeply about freedom. A few months ago, I was visiting our missionaries in Vienna, and one day my family and I were sightseeing, and I bought tickets to the Hofburg Palace, got on the subway, took the subway to the Hofburg Palace, popped up, walked for a while, stood in a really long line, got to the entrance of the palace, handed my tickets to the lady at the counter, and she scanned them, and they wouldn't scan properly, so she looked at them closer, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, you actually bought these tickets for tomorrow." Well, I was leaving the next day, and I couldn't go tomorrow, and so even though she was clearly in the right, and I was clearly in the wrong, I began to argue with her with no basis. Like, I want to go. I want to get in this museum today. Please let me in this museum, or let me in the palace. And, well, I'm sorry, sir, your tickets are for tomorrow. And I was just beside myself because I really wanted to get in, and so I was trying any tactic I could think of, like, Anna and Heidi, look sad, look very, very sad, and, I need to talk to your supervisor. And I was doing anything I could to get into this palace. Now, why was I acting this way? Well, in some ways it's because I'm an American. I didn't want someone telling me what I could and could not do. So one angle on American freedom is this. Freedom is the aversion to outside authority. Think about the origin of our country. We were rebelling against the authority of Britain. And that has gone on through the years, and so we don't like people telling us what to do. We don't like people tracking our data. We don't like people taxing our income. We don't like people knowing our location. Like this is American freedom. It's a very important value. In the book of Galatians, Paul talks a lot about freedom, and he says this: "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free." Is this freedom that Paul talks about the same as the freedom defined by American freedom? Or for that matter, I want you to think about this. One of the most beautiful and important ministries at the Memorial Road Church of Christ is our international ministry. Clay Hart does a phenomenal job leading this ministry. And so every week there's people from lots of different countries. And they worship with us. They go to class together. There's people from China and Korea. There's people from Japan, people from Latin America. So when people not in the United States read this text, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free," what do they think? How do they interpret Paul? Is this the same kind of freedom that the average American thinks of when they hear the word freedom? Well, for starters, in exploring these issues, it's helpful to lay out the social situation in Galatians. Paul is writing to a specific social problem. And so you generally have two groups of people. At least this is what most scholars say about this letter. You've got what's called the Judaizers, and these are Jews that believe in Jesus, that really think that you also need to follow the law of Moses. And so they're coming into the church saying, Jesus is great, but you have to be circumcised. We might call these people the rule followers. And so for the rule followers, the rules give grounding for life. The rules make sense of reality. We feel better because we can lean upon these rules. And many of us relate to that sentiment. We like the rules. Well, there's another group of people at this church. These are Gentile, formerly pagan religious folks, but they've come to know Jesus. And they don't know the Old Testament. They don't really care about the Old Testament. They believe in Jesus, but they still want to live out the lifestyles of their pre-conversion experiences, specifically in regards to how they handle money, specifically in regards to their sexual practices, and specifically in regards to social dynamics. They want to keep these former parts of their lives. And so we might call these people the open-minded. And so they love Jesus, but they just think that because Jesus is so wonderful and grace-centered and forgiving, he'll be okay with whatever kind of life that I choose. So I'm going to be very open-minded. Now you can imagine these two groups of people, they did not like each other. So the rule followers would look at the open-minded crowd and say, well, you guys are just downright sinful. And the open-minded crowd would look at the rule followers and would say, well, you guys are just downright legalistic. And so these groups had a lot of tension between each other. So Paul, his main thesis in this section of Galatians is this: both groups are actually in slavery. So for example, in verse 1 of chapter 5, he says this: do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. So he's specifically talking to the rule followers here, and he's saying that the law is a form of slavery. You think that you are free, but you're not, because you are in chains to the law. But also notice in verse 13, now he's more talking to the open-minded Gentile crowd. He says, do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. So sure, you might be free in one sense, but you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't be shackled by this. And the word he uses here is flesh. In the Greek, it's sarx. It has a super broad range of meaning. in the New Testament, but in this context, sarx would mean the sinful desires you have within you. The desire to pursue your own passion, your own pleasure, over and against other people. So this is the part of you that wants to rush to be first in line. This is the part of you that covets your friend's car. This is the part of you that objectifies a man or a woman to suit whatever fancy it is that you have. Sarx, it's flesh. But Paul's arguing here that the flesh is actually a form of slavery. So he makes this clear as well in Romans 7, where Paul famously says, I am a prisoner of the law of sin within me. So in Galatians 5:1, he's saying you can be a prisoner to the law, but in Romans 7 and elsewhere in Galatians 5, he's saying you can also be a prisoner to the flesh, to the sin within. So the overall case that I'm making here with Paul's text is that there's no freedom that doesn't come with a limitation. In other words, all forms of freedom come with some kind of limitation. Like there's no truly unlimited freedom where you just do whatever you want, whenever you want, doesn't really matter. Like those kinds of people that follow just completely unlimited freedom, they will either end up dead or in prison. Like this form of freedom just can't exist in the world. All forms of freedom carry some kind of limitations. For the rule followers, it's the rules. For the open-minded, it's this flesh, it's this sarx, it's this sinful nature within. So, the challenge here is specifically for these open-minded people, and many of us would consider ourselves open-minded. We can do whatever we want. The challenge here is trying to understand how exactly that's slavery. And the reason this is hard, at least for me to understand, is because my desires feel so natural. The things that I want to do, they're just instinctive. I want to eat this. I want to drink that. I want to spend time with her. I want to hang out with him. I want to buy this. I want to consume that. I want to defeat him. I want to beat her. These desires, they're normal. They're natural. I don't have to think about them. But the case that Paul is making here in Galatians 5 is this. Those desires, which seem normal and natural and innocent, they will put you in chains in the blink of an eye. Case in point, we are now 250 years into this freedom experience in the experiment in the United States of America. Last year, the CDC reported that there are more cases of addiction last year than in any other year in the history of the country. So the land of the free has become the headquarters of addiction. How is that possible? Well, the reason it's possible is because we have followed our heart, and our heart has put chains on us. As the great theologian Ariana Grande says in her famous song, I see it, I like it, I want it, I got it. And you can do this for a while and everything's fine at first, but then you practice this kind of lifestyle month after month, year after year, and you realize that the desires of your hearts became the blueprints for your prison. Now the irony is, most people give a green light to their heart and reserve their skepticism for everything outside their heart. So my skepticism I reserve to all these other institutions and authorities. Well, I can't trust the church. I can't trust my professor. I can't really even trust my parents. Certainly can't trust the government. And so I'm going to be skeptical about all these other institutions and authorities in the world. But for my heart, green light. My heart must be the one thing that I can trust. And what Paul is saying is, you do that, you will be destroyed. In some ways, the greatest threat to your well-being is your sarx, your flesh, this heart that you have within you. And ironically, it's the one place of our lives that we give the least critical evaluation. I was was thinking about the deceptive nature of the heart. It dawned on me writing this message. Do you know what has increased by 300% in the last 15 years? Protests, like public protests in the country. Now, they've always been around, even since in times of Scripture. You can think about the story of Exodus as a story of protest. Moses, rightly so, is protesting a government which has overreached their power. And that's often what protests do. Think about the civil rights movement in the 60s. Well, the last 15 years, protests have increased by over 300%. It's like, what is this telling us about us as people, about us as a nation? And this isn't an exact study, but this is my gut feel on this. It seems to me that in years gone by, we spent more time evaluating our own hearts. Like we knew that evil and good existed in the self. And so we would be very critical about self-examination. What's going on in my own heart? It doesn't seem like that we do that as much anymore. Rather than critically evaluate the self, we instead spend all that energy critically evaluating the world. Like, think about what upsets you the most. Is it your own sin within your own self? Or is it the group that you don't like? So we've taken all this energy that we used to spend practicing self-examination, and we've just spewed that out into the world. We used to have more grace for the world because we understood the wickedness within. But that's not the case anymore. We don't spend a lot of energy with self-examination, and that's what fuels all the hatred that we have for the world. So it's this great irony. The one thing that I think needs self-examination is the self, and we have forgotten how to do that. John Mark Comer has a great analysis in his book on this front. His book's called Live No Lies. A lot of you know of it and read it. I read it 2 or 3 years ago. It's a great book, but this one section of the book really stuck out to me. He did this historical analysis on how cultures throughout time have always believed that there is a battle going on like deep in the inner self. So you go back to Buddha. Buddha taught this. There was the mind of desire pitted against the mind of harmony, and they were in conflict with each other. Plato also wrote about this. Plato's metaphor for the battle of the inner self was, he said there's a chariot with 2 horses, and you have the horse called honor and the horse called, infidelity or undignified or something like that, and they were against each other. Ancient Jewish rabbis, same thing. They would talk about the war within the soul. And Paul most clearly, look at this. In this same text, Galatians chapter 5, he says this. The flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so you are not to do whatever you want. Like, that's so clear. Paul's saying in the heart, in the self, there is this big war going on here. So the common denominator is this. For most of human history, across religions, it was assumed that the self or the heart was not to be trusted, that it was deceptive, and that it could lead to all kinds of harm. But nowadays, follow your heart. The era of sin has been replaced by the era of self. And we are clearly not better for this. So here's another ancient voice that speaks into this. So this is a guy named Edmund Burke, 1791. So this is right at the birth of American democracy. And he has this brilliant insight on democracy is not going to work if you don't have this in place. Here's what he says. A little bit of old language. I'll try to explain what he's saying. So 1791, he says, men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites. In other words, people can be free only to the extent that they control their own desires within. You gotta have something to control these appetites within. He goes on to say this: society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere. So we have to have limitations. And the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. So the less discipline we have as citizens on the inside, the more that this will have to be forced upon us from the outside. He concludes, "It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters." So fetters were chains, and he's saying that passion pursued blindly only leads to bondage. So isn't that interesting? At the birth of democracy, at the birth of this American experiment of freedom, Edmund Burke is saying it only works if people adopt some sense of moral framework. You can't just do whatever you want. You can't just follow your heart and have a modern state, democratic society thrive and function. If everyone does what they want to do, democracy will crumble. So, all this to say, we find ourselves obsessed with freedom, but living in slavery because we have followed our hearts. So, what do we do? Galatians 5. Here's how Paul comes out and solves this tension. Verse 13, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh." And here's the positive side of things. "Rather, serve one another in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself." So remember here, the premise of the message is that every form of freedom carries some form of limitation. Could be rules, could be your own sinful desires. Paul here is articulating this is the limitation of the freedom that is focused on Christ. Freedom in Christ is regulated by neighbor love. That's the limitation. Not rules, not circumcision, not the whole Old Testament, certainly not following the desires of your heart. The limitation is neighbor love. Now, you might think, well, that sounds like he's trying to limit what I want to do, and that sounds repressive, and I don't know if I want to do that. Okay, bear with me here. I want you to imagine that you adopt a two-step rule to life. And you abide by these two rules with every fiber of your being. And you just think what would happen in your life if you did this. Rule number 1. I will consciously choose to put the needs of other people ahead of my own. My friends, my family, my brothers and sisters in Christ, my coworker, I am going to, like every minute of the day, choose to put their need above my own. That's rule 1. Rule 2 is this: I will then do whatever I want. I mean, think about what kind of life that would lead towards. You elevate the needs of others above your own, and then I'm just going to do anything I want within that framework. Be a pretty beautiful life, wouldn't it? Like, can you imagine that life leading to like guilt or second guessing yourself? Like, why did I do that? No, there'd be no shame. There'd be no fear. I mean, if you lived your life this way, it would be so full of love and peace and service. I mean, it would be a remarkable life to live. And I know, some people read Paul or hear a message like this and they interpret it as a power play. And just one more preacher who's just trying to get me to do what he wants them to do. No, that's not at all what I'm saying. It's not manipulative. Like, I'm actually saying if you adopt this kind of freedom, which includes this limitation of neighbor love, I think it's the best possible life you could live. In fact, let me just two reasons I think that. Number one, here's a little Bible trivia question. You can answer out loud. How does this section end? Like, what is the end of Galatians 5? What is it? For those of you that know, how does the whole section end? The fruit of the Spirit. So when you live your life this way, where neighbor love becomes the regulatory marker for how you practice your freedom, what it produces is this life full of love and joy and peace and patience, not restriction, not negativity, not, I can't do anything I want. No, it's a beautiful life when you live this kind of freedom with this kind of limitation. That's the first reason I think this is the way to go. Here's the second reason. Jesus Christ. On the one hand, Jesus Christ was more bound to the principle of neighbor love than any human being who has ever walked the face of the earth. Jesus practiced neighbor love deeply from day one. He loved the sick. He loved the poor. He gave his time, his energy. He put his life on the line in the days leading up to his death. And then he literally put his life on the line to give it up to save the world. Jesus is the embodiment of neighbor love. He was bound by that. And yet, Jesus Christ was the most free person to ever live. He wasn't bound by anything or anyone. Rome had no authority over Jesus. The Pharisees and the Sadducees had no authority over Jesus. The disciples had no authority over. Jesus was totally free and yet totally full of neighbor love. So here's the truth. You have to choose some kind of freedom. So you might as well choose a kind of freedom that leads to life. So as we close this series on this sub-series on self-denial, please don't follow your heart. Practice self-denial. That's the way to life. So we're about to sing a song, and if you need the prayers of this church in a public way, I'll ask you to come down and let me know what's going on in your life, and we'll surround you in prayer. If you want to get baptized today and put this yoke of Jesus demonstratively into your life through the water of baptism, we'd love to witness your rebirth into Christ. You're welcome to come talk to me about that while we stand and sing.